The desert wind carried the scent of sage and distant rain as Maria's singing bird crouched behind the weathered boulder, her heart hammering against her ribs. The sound of approaching horses grew louder, their hooves striking the hard-packed earth in a rhythm that spelled danger. She pressed her palm against her mouth to stifle the sob that threatened to escape. Remembering the terrible morning that had torn her world apart just 3 days ago, the Apache camp had been peaceful in the early dawn light. Children played between the wickiups while women prepared the morning meal, their voices creating a gentle murmur that blended with the crackling of cooking fires. Maria had been braiding her long black hair, the strands falling past her waist like a silken waterfall. Her hair was her pride, a symbol of her womanhood and her connection to her ancestors. Her grandmother had taught her the sacred meanings woven into each braid, how her hair held the stories of her people. The soldiers had come without warning, their blue uniforms stark against the golden landscape. Captain Morrison led them, his face hard as granite beneath the brim of his hat. Maria had seen him before, during the failed peace talks, had noticed how his eyes held no warmth, no understanding of her people's ways. Behind him rode 20 men, their rifles gleaming in the morning sun. The attack was swift and brutal. The soldiers scattered the cooking fires, overturned water vessels, and drove the people from their homes like animals. Maria's father, Chief Standing Bear, had tried to reason with them. Speaking in the broken English he had learned from traders. But Morrison's orders were clear. All Apache were to be relocated to the reservation immediately. No exceptions. No delays. Maria had tried to run toward the horses with her younger brother, hoping to escape into the familiar maze of canyons beyond the camp. But rough hands seized her, dragging her back toward the center of the chaos. She fought like a wildcat, her nails raking across a soldier's face, drawing blood. Her defiance only made them angrier. "This one's got spirit," Morrison had said, his voice cold as winter wind. "We'll need to break that." 2 soldiers held her arms while Morrison drew a long knife from his belt. The blade caught the morning light, flashing like lightning. Maria's eyes widened as she realized his intention. In Apache culture, a woman's hair was sacred, connected to her spiritual power and her place in the tribe. To cut it was the deepest shame, worse than death itself. "No," she had whispered in English, then screamed it in Apache. "No." But Morrison was already sawing through her beautiful braids, the knife cutting roughly, painfully. Her hair fell to the ground in long, dark ribbons, each severed strand feeling like a piece of her soul being torn away. The other women wailed, knowing the profound violation they were witnessing. Even some of the soldiers looked uncomfortable, shifting uneasily in their saddles. When it was finished, Maria's hair hung in ragged chunks around her shoulders, uneven and humiliating. Morrison kicked the severed braids into the fire, and Maria watched her pride burn, the acrid smoke stinging her eyes and throat. The message was clear. The Apache way of life would be destroyed, piece by piece, until nothing remained. "Now you look like a civilized woman," Morrison had said, words like poison in her ears. "Load them up." We moved for the reservation within the hour, but Maria had not broken. As the soldiers bound her hands, she caught sight of movement in the rocks above the camp. A lone figure watched from the shadows, a man she recognized but had never spoken to. Jake Thunder was what the Apache called him, though his real name was Jacoby Millhouse. He was a cowboy who had lived on the edges of Apache territory for 3 years. Respecting their boundaries, trading fairly when their paths crossed, Jake was tall and lean, with sun-weathered skin and eyes the color of storm clouds. Unlike other white men, he had taken time to learn some Apache words, had shown respect for their customs. Maria's father had spoken of him with grudging approval, calling him the one who walks softly. Their eyes met across the chaos of the destroyed camp, and Maria saw something in Jake's expression that gave her hope. Anger burned there, but also determination. He touched the brim of his hat in a subtle salute, a promise that she understood without words. Then he melted back into the rocks like a ghost, visible to the soldiers below. The journey to the reservation was a nightmare of dust, hunger, and despair. The soldiers drove the Apache like cattle, allowing few stops for rest or water. Maria's shortened hair whipped around her face in the desert wind, a constant reminder of her humiliation. But she did not cry. She would not give Morrison that satisfaction. On the second night, as the group made camp in a narrow canyon, Maria managed to slip her bonds and escape into the darkness. She ran through the night, following game trails and dry creek beds, putting as much distance as possible between herself and her captors. Behind her, she could hear dogs barking and men shouting. But the desert was her ally, hiding her tracks in the shifting sand. Now, crouched behind the boulder with pursuit closing in, Maria made a desperate decision. She would not return to the reservation to live in shame. She would not let them complete the destruction of her spirit. Better to die free in the desert than live broken in captivity. The horses were very close now. She could hear the jingle of spurs, the creak of leather saddles. Maria closed her eyes and began to sing softly, a death song her grandmother had taught her, preparing her spirit for the journey to the next world. But instead of capture, she heard the sound of gunfire erupting from the canyon ahead. Men shouted in alarm, horses screamed and reared. Through the chaos, she heard a voice calling out in Apache, speaking words that made her heart leap with sudden impossible hope. Maria singing bird. It is Jake Thunder. I am here. The cowboy had come for her, bringing with him the promise of a fight that would change everything. As Maria crept toward the sound of his voice, her hand unconsciously touched the ragged remains of her hair. The shame burned as fresh as ever. But now it was joined by something else, a fierce determination to reclaim what had been taken from her, to make those who had humiliated her pay the price for their cruelty. The desert wind carried her forward into an uncertain future. But for the first time in 3 days, Maria's singing bird allowed herself to hope. Jake's Thunder crouched behind a jumble of red sandstone, his Winchester rifle steady in his calloused hands. The morning sun painted the canyon walls in shades of gold and crimson. But his attention was focused entirely on the 6 soldiers picking their way carefully down the narrow trail below. Their blue uniforms made them easy targets against the pale rock. And Jake had already calculated the range and wind direction he had been tracking. Maria's escape since the previous evening, reading the signs in the desert like words on a page, a broken twig here, a disturbed stone there, the faint impression of a small foot in sandy soil. The Apache had taught him well during his years on the frontier. Lessons learned through careful observation and mutual respect rather than the brutal subjugation favored by the army. Jake's jaw tightened as he remembered what he had witnessed at the Apache camp 3 days ago. He had been returning from a cattle drive, his horse picking its way through the familiar maze of canyons, when the sound of screaming had drawn him to the ridge overlooking Standing Bear's village. What he saw there had filled him with a cold rage that still burned in his chest. The systematic destruction of the camp was bad enough, but watching Morrison hack off Maria's beautiful hair had crossed a line that Jake could not forgive. He had seen Apache women before, had admired their grace and strength, but Maria Singing Bird was different. He had noticed her during trading visits, the way she carried herself with quiet dignity, how her eyes sparked with intelligence and barely concealed fire. Jake had never spoken to her directly. Apache customs were strict about interactions between unmarried men and women, but he had felt a connection that transcended words. When their eyes met, across the chaos of the destroyed village, he had seen her spirit unbroken despite the violation she had endured. In that moment, he had made a silent vow to help her, whatever the cost. The lead soldier below raised his hand, signaling for a halt. Sergeant Williams, Jake recognized him from previous encounters at the fort. A decent man, unlike Morrison, but still bound by orders that Jake could not respect. Williams dismounted and knelt beside a clear footprint in the sandy wash, pointing and speaking in low tones to his men. "Trail's getting fresher. Boys," Williams said. "She can't be far ahead now. Keep your eyes open and your mouths shut. Captain Morrison wants her back alive, but he didn't say she had to be unmarked." The casual cruelty in the sergeant's words made Jake's finger tighten on the trigger. These men saw Maria as nothing more than a runaway animal to be recaptured. Not understanding the proud woman whose world they had shattered, Jake had spent enough time among the Apache to know that for Maria. Returning to the reservation with her hair shorn and her dignity destroyed would be a fate. Worse than death. Jake waited until the soldiers were strung out along the narrow canyon floor, then took careful aim at a spot just in front of William's horse. The Winchester barked, its echo bouncing off the canyon walls like thunder. The bullet struck the ground precisely where Jake intended, sending up a spray of sand and rock that spooked the horses and sent the soldiers diving for cover. "Apache," William shouted, his voice tight with fear. "Take cover. Return fire." But Jake was already moving, using the maze of boulders and ledges to his advantage. He fired twice more, each shot precisely placed to pin down the soldiers without killing them. These men were just following orders, however misguided. His real enemy was Morrison and the system that had sanctioned such brutality. "This is Sergeant Williams of the United States Army," the soldier called out, his voice echoing off the rocks. "Come out with your hands visible and you won't be harmed." Jake almost laughed at the irony. The Army's promises meant nothing after what they had done to Maria's people. Instead of answering, he called out in Apache, his voice carrying clearly through the canyon. "Maria Singing Bird. It is Jake Sunder. I am here." He saw a movement among the rocks on the far side of the canyon and caught a glimpse of Maria's dark head as she peered out from her hiding place. Even at this distance, he could see the ragged remains of her once beautiful hair, and fresh anger coursed through him. She was perhaps 200 yards away, separated from him by the soldiers and the treacherous canyon floor. "There," one of the soldiers shouted, pointing toward Maria's position. "I saw movement in those rocks." Williams deployed his men with practiced efficiency, sending 3 toward Maria's hiding spot while the others kept watch for more Apache. Jake realized he had to act quickly before they captured her. He broke cover, running along the canyon rim with the agility of a mountain goat. Drawing the soldiers' attention back to himself, bullets whined off the rocks around him as he zigzagged through the boulders. But Jake knew this country better than any soldier. He had ridden these canyons for 3 years, learning every hidden trail and secret passage. The Army maps showed this area as blank wilderness, but to Jake, it was as familiar as his own backyard. He reached a narrow ledge that ran along the canyon wall. Invisible from below, but offering a clear shot at the soldiers approaching Maria's position, Jake lined up his rifle and fired, the bullet striking the ground inches from the lead soldier's foot. The man yelped and stumbled backward, losing his footing on the loose rock. "Fall back," Williams ordered. "Regroup at the mouth of the canyon." But Jake was already implementing the second part of his plan. He had spotted Maria during the brief firefight, had seen her moving carefully along the base of the opposite canyon wall. There was a narrow passage there, hidden behind a screen of scrub oak and manzanita that led up to the rim. If she could reach it before the soldiers reorganized, she might escape. Jake cupped his hands around his mouth and called out in Apache, using the words he had learned during his years on the frontier. "Broken trail woman. The hidden path. Behind the twisted tree." He hoped she would understand his meaning. The twisted tree was a distinctive juniper that grew from a crack in the canyon wall, its gnarled branches forming a natural landmark. The hidden path behind it was an old game trail that the Apache had used for generations. Invisible to untrained eyes, but offering a route to safety for those who knew where to look. Maria's head appeared briefly among the rocks, and Jake saw her nod in understanding. She had heard him, had recognized the reference to the ancient trail. But the soldiers were already moving again, spreading out to cut off her escape routes. Jake knew he had to buy her more time. He moved along the ledge, keeping low to avoid presenting a target until he reached a position directly above the soldiers. From here, he could see their entire deployment, could predict their movements before they made them. He began a systematic harassment campaign, firing carefully aimed shots that kept the soldiers pinned down but avoided causing serious injury. A bullet through a water bottle here, another that knocked a hat from a man's head there. Each shot was a message. You are being watched. You are outmatched. You are in danger. Williams was getting frustrated. Jake could see it in the way the sergeant gestured angrily at his men. They had come expecting to capture one frightened Apache woman, not engage in a running gun battle with an unseen enemy who seemed to know their every move. "Whoever you are up there, Williams called out. "This is Army business. That woman is a prisoner of the United States government." Jake's response was another carefully placed shot that sent Williams diving behind a boulder. The message was clear. The Army's authority meant nothing in these canyons. Here, different laws applied. Older laws that recognized courage and justice over uniforms and orders. As the standoff continued, Jake caught glimpses of Maria making her way toward the hidden trail. She moved like a ghost through the shadows, using every bit of cover available. Her shortened hair was actually an advantage now, making her less visible among the rocks and brush. But the soldiers were beginning to spread out, trying to flank both Jake and Maria simultaneously. Time was running out, and Jake realized that his diversionary tactics could only work for so long. Soon, he would have to make a choice: continue to harass the soldiers and risk Maria's capture, or reveal his position in a desperate attempt to help her escape. The sun climbed higher, turning the canyon into an oven of reflected heat and dancing shadows. Somewhere in that maze of rock and scrub, Maria's singing bird crept toward freedom, while below, 6 determined soldiers closed the net around both of them. Jake Thunder checked his ammunition and prepared for the fight of his life. Maria's bare feet found purchase on the ancient game trail, each step taking her higher up the canyon wall and further from the soldiers below. Her heart pounded not just from exertion, but from the overwhelming realization that someone had risked everything to help her. Jake Thunder, the quiet cowboy who had always shown respect to her people, was down there fighting 6 armed soldiers. To give her a chance at freedom, the twisted juniper that marked the entrance to the hidden path was just ahead, its gnarled branches reaching out from the rock face like welcoming arms. Maria had traveled this trail as a child with her grandmother, learning the old stories and the sacred places hidden throughout Apache territory. Now those childhood lessons might save her life. Behind her, the gunfire continued in sharp, echoing bursts. Jake was keeping the soldiers occupied, but she could hear Sergeant Williams shouting orders, reorganizing his men. They would not be fooled much longer. Maria pressed herself against the canyon wall and listened, trying to judge the distance and direction of the voices below. "Jenkins, you and Murphy circle around to the east rim," Williams commanded. "Thompson, stay here with me and keep that shooter pinned down. Harris and Coleman, work your way up the western slope. This canyon only has 2 ways out, and we're going to cover both of them." Maria's blood ran cold. The soldiers were splitting up, trying to trap both her and Jake in a classic military maneuver. Worse, they seemed to know about the upper trails, which meant someone at the fort had studied Apache territory more carefully than her people had realized. She reached the twisted juniper and slipped behind it, finding the narrow opening that led to the hidden trail. The passage was barely wide enough for one person, carved by centuries of wind and water into the living rock. As a child, she had been frightened by its claustrophobic confines, but now the tight walls offered comfort and concealment. The trail wound upward through a series of natural chimneys and ledges, invisible from below and nearly impossible to detect even from above unless you knew exactly where to look. Maria climbed steadily, her hands finding familiar handholds, her feet remembering the rhythm of ascent that her grandmother had taught her long ago. But as she climbed, her mind was not on escape. Instead, she found herself thinking about Jake Thunder and the impossible situation he had placed himself in for her sake. By attacking federal soldiers, even to wound rather than kill, he had marked himself as an outlaw. There would be no going back to his old life, no return to peaceful cattle ranching in Apache territory. Captain Morrison would hunt him to the ends of the earth. The thought filled Maria with both gratitude and guilt. She had not asked for his help, had not even spoken to him beyond polite nods during trading visits to her father's camp. Yet he had thrown away his future for her, and she could not understand why. Among her people, such sacrifice was reserved for family, for lovers. For those bound by the strongest ties of kinship and affection, a bullet ricocheted off the rocks somewhere below, followed by the sharp crack of Jake's rifle. The sound seemed closer now. Maria realized that the battle was moving up the canyon walls as the soldiers tried to reach higher ground. She paused in her climb and listened, trying to make sense of the tactical situation developing below. I can see muzzle flashes. From that ledge system, she heard one of the soldiers call out. He's moving along the rim, maybe 200 yards north of our position. Keep him busy, Williams responded. Murphy, are you in position yet? Almost, Sergeant. Give me 5 more minutes. Maria understood the deadly game being played out in the rocks below. The soldiers were trying to box Jake in, to cut off his escape routes, just as they had attempted with her. But Jake had an advantage they did not expect. He was not fighting alone. Maria might not be able to use a rifle, but she knew these canyons better than any white man. And she had other skills that her grandmother had taught her. She reached a wider section of the trail where an ancient rock fall had created a natural platform. From here, she could see down into the canyon, where the main battle was taking place. Jake was visible as a moving shadow along the opposite rim, darting from cover to cover as he tried to stay ahead of the converging soldiers. He moved with the fluid grace of a man who had learned to survive in harsh country. But Maria could see that he was being pushed into an increasingly desperate position. 2 soldiers were climbing toward him from the east, while another pair worked their way up the western approach. Williams and 1 other man remained in the canyon bottom, ready to cut off any retreat in that direction. It was a well-executed trap. Maria realized that Jake had perhaps minutes before they closed the net around him. She looked around desperately, trying to think of some way to help. Her eyes fell on a collection of loose stones that had accumulated on the platform over the centuries. The rocks varied in size from pebbles to chunks as large as her fist, all weathered smooth by wind and rain. An idea began to form in Maria's mind. Born from childhood games and refined by necessity, Maria selected the largest stones she could throw accurately and began to hurl them down into the canyon. Not at the soldiers, she was too far away for that, but at strategic points along the canyon floor, where the sound would echo and multiply. The first stone struck with a sharp crack that bounced off the walls like gunfire. The second and third followed quickly, creating a symphony of false impacts that made it impossible to tell where the real shots were coming. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The soldiers below began firing wildly at shadows, convinced they were under attack from multiple directions. In the confusion, Jake broke cover and sprinted along the rim toward a narrow chimney that would take him down to the canyon floor. Maria held her breath as bullets whined around him, but his desperate gamble paid off. He reached the chimney and disappeared into its protective shadows. Cease fire. Williams shouted, You're wasting ammunition on echoes? But the damage was done. In the moments of confusion that Maria had created, Jake had managed to break out of the trap and reach a more defensible position. She felt a fierce pride in her contribution to the battle, a sense that she was not merely a victim to be rescued, but an active participant in her own salvation. The gunfire resumed, but with a different rhythm now. Jake was on the move again, working his way along the canyon floor toward the mouth of the gorge. Maria realized that he was trying to draw the soldiers away from her position, sacrificing his own safety to ensure her escape. The nobility of his gesture took her breath away. She continued her climb, moving faster now despite the growing exhaustion in her legs and lungs. The hidden trail wound through increasingly narrow passages, sometimes opening onto ledges that offered spectacular views of the surrounding desert, sometimes closing in so tightly that she had to turn sideways to squeeze through gaps in the rock as she climbed. Maria found herself thinking not about escape, but about return. She could reach the canyon rim and disappear into the vast wilderness beyond, could make her way to the camps of other Apache bands who still lived free in the remote mountain strongholds. But that would mean abandoning Jake to face the consequences of his actions alone, and the thought was unbearable. Her grandmother had taught her that all actions carried consequences. That honor demanded payment of debts whether they were asked for or not. Jake Thunder had given her the gift of freedom, had risked everything for a woman he barely knew. Apache law and Apache honor demanded that such a debt be acknowledged and repaid. Maria reached a fork in the trail, where one path led upward to the rim, while the other curved back toward the canyon floor through a series of hidden passages. For a moment she hesitated, torn between the promise of safety and the pull of obligation. Below, the The gunfire continued. Each shot a reminder that a man was fighting for his life in her defense. She looked once more toward the path that led to freedom, then turned her back on it and chose the trail that would take her back into danger. Jake Thunder had come for her when she needed help. Now it was her turn to come for him. The descent was treacherous, requiring all her skill and concentration, but Maria's feet found their way surely down the ancient path. She was no longer running from the soldiers, but moving toward them, driven by a sense of purpose that burned brighter than fear. Whatever happened next, she would face it with her honor intact and her debts paid. Jake's ammunition was running dangerously low. He crouched behind a weathered boulder at the mouth of the canyon, his chest heaving from the desperate run down the chimney trail. Sweat stung his eyes, and his throat was parched, but he could not afford to show weakness now. 3 soldiers were working their way toward him through the maze of rocks. While Williams and the others maintained their positions to cut off any retreat back into the canyon. The cowboy checked his rifle, 4 rounds left, plus the 6 shots in his Colt revolver. Against 6 trained soldiers it was not nearly enough. But Jake had not lived 3 years on the Apache frontier by giving up when the odds turned bad. He had learned patience and cunning from the very people that the army was now trying to destroy, and those lessons might yet save his life. He listened carefully to the sounds around him, sorting the natural noises of the desert from the subtle signs of approaching danger. A loose stone rattled somewhere to his left. One of the soldiers had stepped carelessly and given away his position. The faint jingle of spurs came from straight ahead, perhaps 50 yards distant. Jake smiled grimly. For all their training, these men moved through the desert like cattle in a thunderstorm, announcing their presence to anyone with ears to hear. The memory of Maria's face drove him forward despite the desperate odds. He had seen the pain in her dark eyes when Morrison cut away her beautiful hair, had watched her spirit bend but not break under the humiliation. In that moment, Jake had understood something profound about courage and dignity that no army manual could teach. Maria Singing Bird represented everything noble about the Apache people, everything worth fighting to preserve. Jake had grown up on a hard-scrabble farm in Colorado, where his father preached the gospel of manifest destiny and the civilizing mission of the white race. But 3 years among the Apache had taught him that civilization was not measured by the color of a man's skin or the god he worshipped. The Apache had codes of honor as rigid as any European knight, traditions of hospitality that put Christian charity to shame, and a connection to the land that made white men's claims of ownership seem like the ravings of madmen. A rifle bullet chipped stone from the boulder beside his head, and Jake forced himself back to the immediate danger. The soldiers were getting closer, their circle tightening like a noose around his throat. He needed to break out of their trap before they could coordinate their final assault. But every option seemed to lead to certain death. Then he heard something that made his heart leap with impossible hope. The sound of stones falling from high above, followed by shouts of confusion from the soldiers in the canyon. Jake recognized the tactical brilliance immediately. Someone was creating a diversion using the canyon's acoustics to multiply phantom threats and confuse the enemy. It had to be Maria, somehow. She had not fled to safety, but had instead chosen to help him fight. The diversion gave Jake the opening he needed. While the soldiers were distracted by the false echoes, he sprinted from his hiding place toward a cluster of boulders that offered better cover in a clear field of fire. Bullets whined around him, but his sudden movement had caught the soldiers off guard. He slid behind the rocks just as return fire began to concentrate on his previous position. From his new vantage point, Jake could see 2 soldiers advancing toward him through a narrow defile between towering rock formations. They moved with textbook precision, one covering while the other advanced, but they had made a crucial mistake. The defile was a natural funnel that channeled them into a killing zone where Jake's superior marksmanship could make up for his disadvantage in numbers. Jake aimed carefully and fired, his bullet striking the lead soldier's rifle and sending it spinning from his hands. The man cried out in shock and dove for cover, while his companion opened up with rapid fire that filled the air with flying stone chips. Jake waited patiently for the soldier to reload, then fired again, this bullet passing so close to the man's head that he flattened himself against the ground and stayed there. 3 rounds left in the Winchester. Jake worked the lever action and scanned for new threats, his senses alert for any sign of movement. The canyon had fallen silent except for the whisper of wind through stone arches and the distant call of a circling hawk. Even the phantom stone falls had stopped, suggesting that Maria had moved to a new position. "Give it up, friend," Sergeant Williams called from somewhere in the canyon behind him. "You're surrounded and outgunned. Surrender now, and we'll see that you get a fair trial." Jake almost laughed at the bitter irony. A fair trial from the same army that had burned Maria's hair as a symbol of conquest? The same military that drove peaceful people from their ancestral homes at gunpoint? Jake had seen enough army justice to know that his trial would be nothing more than a prelude to a hanging. Instead of answering, Williams. Jake used his remaining ammunition to keep the soldiers pinned down while he studied the terrain around him. The mouth of the canyon opened onto a broad valley dotted with stands of juniper and pinyon pine. Beyond that lay open desert, offering concealment but no water for miles. A man on foot would die of thirst long before he could reach help. But Jake was not planning to run. Somewhere in these rocks, Maria was making her own desperate fight for freedom. And he would not abandon her to face capture alone. The soldiers had violated something sacred when they cut away her hair, had committed a sin against the natural order that demanded payment in blood. Jake might die in these canyons, but he would make sure that Maria had every possible chance to escape. A new sound reached. His ears the soft scrape of moccasins on stone, coming from a direction where no soldiers had been positioned. Jake tensed, bringing his rifle around toward the sound, then relaxed as he recognized the slim figure moving through the shadows between the boulders. Maria had somehow worked her way down from the hidden trail and was approaching his position with the ghostly silence that only Apache could achieve. She carried no weapons that Jake could see, but her dark eyes burned with determination as she slipped from shadow to shadow. Her ruined hair hung around her face in jagged strands, but instead of shame, Jake saw fierce purpose in her expression. She had made the same choice he had, to stand and fight rather than run. To face danger with honor rather than seek safety through flight. Maria reached the edge of Jake's defensive position and crouched beside him. Up close, he could see the toll that her ordeal had taken, the exhaustion in her face. The scratches on her arms from climbing through thorny brush, the dried tears that had left salt tracks on her cheeks. But her spirit remained unbroken, her courage undimmed by suffering. "Why did you come back?" Jake whispered in Apache, his pronunciation rough but understandable. "The trail leads to safety. No debt goes unpaid," Maria replied in careful English, her voice soft but steady. "You came for me. I come for you." Her simple words carried the weight of absolute commitment. And Jake felt something shift in his chest like a key turning in a long-locked door. This woman, who had every reason to hate his race and everything it represented, had chosen to trust him with her life. More than that, she had risked her hard-won freedom to help him fight an impossible battle against overwhelming odds. "How many rounds?" Maria asked, nodding toward his rifle. "2," Jake admitted. "6 more in the pistol?" Maria nodded as if this was perfectly adequate for facing 6 well-armed soldiers. She pointed toward a narrow ravine that cut across the valley floor about 200 yards from their position. "Old riverbed," she explained. "Runs north to Hidden Spring. Water and cover." Jake studied the ravine through the shimmering heat haze. It would mean crossing open ground under fire. But it offered their only chance of breaking out of the trap that Williams was tightening around them. More importantly, the hidden spring would give them the water they needed to survive in the desert long enough to reach safety. "Together?" Jake asked, meeting her eyes. "Together," Maria confirmed. And Jake heard in that single word a promise that went far beyond their immediate tactical situation. Whatever happened in the next few minutes would bind them together in ways that neither fully understood yet. Jake checked his weapons one final time and prepared to make the run that would either carry them to freedom or to death. Beside him, Maria Singing Bird gathered herself like a coiled spring, ready to sprint across the killing ground that lay between them and the promise of sanctuary. In her dark eyes, Jake saw the same fierce determination that had carried her people through centuries of warfare and displacement. The unbreakable will that no army could truly conquer. The dash across the open ground felt like racing through hell itself. Jake and Maria burst from cover simultaneously, their feet pounding the hard-packed earth as bullets whistled around them like angry hornets. The ravine seemed impossibly distant, a narrow line of darker earth that wavered in the desert heat like a mirage. Jake fired his remaining rifle rounds without stopping to aim. The shots intended more to discourage pursuit than to hit specific targets. The Winchester was useless now, so he let it fall and drew his Colt revolver while continuing to run. Behind them, he could hear Sergeant Williams shouting orders. The sound of men scrambling over rocks in pursuit. Maria ran with the fluid grace of an antelope, her bare feet finding purchase on ground that would have turned Jake's ankle in his heavy boots. She had torn strips from her dress to wrap around her feet, but he could see blood seeping through the makeshift protection. Still, she kept pace with him, stride for stride, her face set in lines of grim determination. The first shot from behind them went wide, backing up dust several yards to their left. The second was closer, close enough that Jake felt the wind of its passage. He risked a glance over his shoulder and saw 3 soldiers emerging from the rocks, their rifles already reloaded and tracking their fleeing targets. "Drop," Jake shouted, and both he and Maria threw themselves flat just as a volley of shots passed through the space. Where their heads had been a heartbeat before, they crawled forward on their bellies, using every slight depression in the ground for cover. While the soldiers advanced steadily behind them, the ravine was still 50 yards away when Jake realized they were not going to make it. The soldiers had spread out in a line, their disciplined advance cutting off any hope of reaching the sanctuary of the old riverbed. Williams appeared on the left flank, his face grim with determination as he worked the bolt of his rifle. "Surrender now, and you won't be harmed," the sergeant called out, his voice carrying clearly across the desert air. "You're trapped in the open with nowhere to run." Jake's response was a carefully aimed shot from his Colt that struck the ground between Williams' feet, sending the man diving for whatever cover he could find. 4 rounds left in the revolver, and then they would be defenseless against 6 trained soldiers. The mathematics of the situation were brutally simple, but Maria had not given up. As Jake provided covering fire, she began to work her way sideways across the open ground. Using the slight undulations in the terrain to mask her movement, she was heading toward a cluster of barrel cacti that grew near the edge of the ravine, their thick arms offering minimal cover but better than nothing. Jake understood her strategy immediately. If she could reach the cacti, she might be able to provide a distraction that would allow him to break through the soldiers' line. It was a desperate plan with little chance of success, but it was the only option they had left. A bullet struck the ground inches from Maria's elbow, and Jake saw her flinch but continue crawling. Her determination was magnificent and heartbreaking at the same time. This woman, who had already endured so much humiliation and pain, was risking everything for a man she barely knew. The weight of that sacrifice pressed down on Jake like a physical burden. He fired again, this time aiming for effect rather than intimidation. The bullet caught one of the advancing soldiers in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending him crashing to the ground. The man's cries of pain caused the others to falter momentarily, giving Maria the seconds she needed to reach the shelter of the cacti. 3 rounds left. Jake crawled forward, trying to close the distance between himself and the soldiers while they were distracted by their wounded comrade. The desert sun beat down mercilessly, turning his shirt into a sodden mass of sweat and grit. His throat felt like sandpaper, and spots danced before his eyes from heat and exhaustion. From her position among the cacti, Maria began to throw stones at the soldiers with remarkable accuracy. The rocks were too small to cause serious injury, but they served their purpose by breaking the soldiers' concentration and forcing them to divide their attention. Between multiple threats, one stone struck a soldier's rifle barrel just as he was taking aim. Throwing off his shot completely, Williams was rallying his men, shouting orders and trying to coordinate their advance despite the chaos that Maria's improvised barrage was creating. But Jake could see that the sergeant was growing frustrated with the length of time it was taking to capture 2 fugitives. Every minute that passed increased the chance that other Apache might arrive to investigate the gunfire. Jake made his decision. Instead of continuing to crawl, he suddenly leaped to his feet and charged directly at the center of the soldiers' line. The unexpected move caught them off guard, and their shots went wild as they tried to track his rapidly moving figure. Jake fired twice as he ran, both bullets finding their marks and sending 2 more soldiers diving for cover. The charge carried him into the middle of the soldiers' formation, where their superior numbers became a disadvantage. They could not fire without risking hitting each other, and Jake's desperate assault had shattered their careful coordination. He tackled Williams around the waist, driving the sergeant to the ground and sending his rifle spinning away across the rocky soil. The 2 men wrestled in the dust, trading vicious blows as they fought for control of Jake's remaining pistol. Williams was younger and stronger, but Jake fought with the fury of a man who had nothing left to lose. They rolled across the ground, each trying to gain the advantage. While the other soldiers circled them uncertainly, Maria saw her opportunity and took it. While the soldiers were focused on the struggle between Jake and their sergeant, she sprinted from the cacti toward the ravine. Her feet flew over the rough ground with supernatural speed, covering the remaining distance in seconds that felt like hours. She reached the edge of the old riverbed and looked back to see Jake still wrestling with Williams, while the other soldiers tried to get a clear shot. One of them was raising his rifle, preparing to end the fight with a bullet to Jake's head. Maria did not hesitate. She picked up a rock the size of her fist and hurled it with all her strength. The stone struck that soldier squarely in the forehead, dropping him like a felled tree. His rifle discharged harmlessly into the air as he collapsed, the sound echoing off the canyon walls like thunder. In the moment of shock that followed, Jake managed to break free from Williams and scramble toward the ravine. Bullets pursued him as he ran. But Maria was already in the riverbed, providing covering fire with stones thrown with deadly accuracy. Jake dove over the edge just as a volley of shots tore through the space where he had been standing. He tumbled down the sandy slope and came to rest beside Maria in the blessed shelter of the ravine. For a moment, they simply lay there gasping, hardly believing they had survived the desperate dash across the killing ground. Above them, they could hear Williams shouting orders, organizing his remaining men for a pursuit down into the riverbed. But they had bought themselves precious time and the promise of water somewhere ahead in the hidden spring that Maria remembered from her. Childhood Jake looked at the woman beside him, her face streaked with dust and sweat, her ruined hair wild around her shoulders. She had saved his life not once but twice in the past few minutes, had fought beside him with a courage that humbled him. In her dark eyes, he saw something that made his heart race faster than the desperate run across. The dessert had done. "Thank you," he said simply, the words inadequate to express what he felt. Maria smiled for the first time since her capture, a radiant expression that transformed her face completely. "We are not safe yet, Cowboy," she said, "but we are alive, and we are together. That is enough for now." Above them, the sounds of pursuit were growing closer. But in the temporary sanctuary of the ravine, with the promise of water ahead and the memory of their shared courage fresh in their minds, Jake and Maria prepared to face whatever came next with their honor intact and their spirits unbroken. The hidden spring emerged from the earth like a miracle, its clear water pooling in a natural basin carved from red sandstone over countless centuries. Ancient petroglyphs decorated the surrounding rocks, spiral patterns and animal figures that spoke of the sacred nature of this place to Maria's people. Here, generations of Apache had come to drink and rest. To seek guidance from the spirits that dwelt in flowing water, Jake knelt beside the pool and cupped the precious liquid in his hands, drinking deeply while keeping one eye on the ravine behind them. The water was cool and sweet, tasting of minerals and earth, more refreshing than any liquor he had ever consumed. Beside him, Maria drank with the reverence of one who understood that water was life itself in this harsh land. They had been following the old riverbed for nearly 2 hours. Staying low and moving carefully to avoid detection from above, the sun had reached its zenith, turning the ravine into a furnace of reflected heat. But the promise of the spring had kept them moving through the worst of it. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit had faded, but not disappeared entirely. Williams was still out there somewhere. Following their trail with the patience of a professional hunter, they will find this place, Maria said quietly, splashing water on her face and neck. The soldiers have Apache scouts now. Men who know the old ways, but serve the bluecoats for silver coins. Jake nodded grimly. He had heard rumors about Apache scouts working for the army. Warriors who had traded their traditional loyalties for the promise of regular meals and protection for their families. The idea sickened him, but he understood the impossible choices that desperate people were forced to make. "How far to the next water?" he asked, filling his canteen and helping Maria wrap fresh cloth around her bleeding feet. "One day's walk, too." "Weeping Rock," she replied, pointing toward the northeast, where distant mountains shimmered in the heat haze. "But the trail is difficult, and the soldiers have horses. They will reach it before us and wait." Jake studied the terrain visible from their position, calculating distances and travel times, with the careful attention of a man whose life depended on such details. Maria was right. Mounted soldiers could easily outflank them and set up ambushes at every known water source. They needed a different strategy, something that would use their advantages while minimizing the soldiers' superior mobility. "What about the forbidden places?" Jake asked. "The areas where your people won't go?" Maria's eyes widened in surprise. She had not expected a white man to know about the sacred sites that Apache tradition declared off-limits to human presence. These were places where powerful spirits dwelt, locations too dangerous for ordinary mortals to visit without proper ceremonies and
protection.
"There is Ghost Canyon," she said slowly, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Water flows there, but the spirits of the angry dead make their home in its shadows. My people avoid it, and the soldiers' Apache scouts will not enter either." Jake had heard stories about Ghost Canyon from other cowboys, tales of strange lights and inexplicable sounds that frightened even the most hardened frontiersmen. He did not know if the supernatural elements were real, but the practical effect was the same. It was a place where they might find sanctuary, simply because others feared to follow. "How do we reach it?" he asked. "We must climb out of this ravine and cross the mesa," Maria explained, pointing toward a steep trail that wound up the canyon wall. 3 miles across open ground, then down into the forbidden place. "But Jake Thunder, you must understand, if we enter Ghost Canyon, we may never leave. The spirits there do not distinguish between Apache and white man. All trespassers face the same fate." Jake considered this warning carefully. He had lived long enough on the frontier to know that some dangers were beyond human understanding, that the desert held mysteries that defied rational explanation. But the alternative was certain capture, followed by imprisonment for himself and a return to the reservation for Maria. Against such prospects, even supernatural peril seemed acceptable. "I would rather face angry spirits than Captain Morrison," Jake said with a grim smile. "At least the dead have honor." Maria nodded slowly, recognizing the truth in his words. Morrison represented a different kind of evil. It's a calculated cruelty of a system that sought to destroy everything beautiful and sacred in the world. The spirits of Ghost Canyon might be dangerous, but they were part of the natural order. Forces to be respected rather than conquered. They prepared to leave the spring with careful attention to covering their tracks. Maria showed Jake how to scatter sand over their footprints, how to arrange stones to hide signs of their passage. It would not fool a skilled tracker indefinitely, but it might buy them the time they needed to reach the safety of the Forbidden Canyon. The climb out of the ravine was treacherous, requiring them to use every hand and foothold in the crumbling sandstone. Jake's boots slipped repeatedly on the loose rock, while Maria seemed to flow up the wall like water running in reverse. Her knowledge of the ancient handholds and hidden ledges made the difference between success and a fatal fall. At the top, they paused to scan the horizon for signs of pursuit. The desert stretched endlessly in all directions, a vast expanse of red rock and sparse vegetation broken only by distant mountain ranges that floated like islands in the heat haze. Behind them, dust clouds marked the progress of the soldiers as they worked their way up the old riverbed toward the spring. The mesa was a nightmare. Of exposed ground with minimal cover, exactly the kind of terrain that favored mounted soldiers over fugitives on foot. But Maria led Jake along ancient game trails that were invisible from a distance. Paths that followed the subtle contours of the land and made use of every shadow, every fold in the rock that might conceal their passage. They were halfway across when Jake heard the distant sound of a bugle call echoing from the direction of the spring. Williams had found their trail and was summoning his scattered men for a coordinated pursuit. The sound sent a chill down Jake's spine. It's not from fear, but from the certain knowledge that there would be no mercy if they were captured now. He had wounded soldiers, had interfered with a military operation, had helped a prisoner escape federal custody. The army would hang him without hesitation. Faster, Maria urged, breaking into a trot despite her injured feet. They have found the spring. They ran across the exposed mesa with desperate urgency. No longer concerned with stealth, but focused entirely on reaching the sanctuary of Ghost Canyon before the soldiers could organize an effective pursuit. Behind them, Jake could hear the thunder of hoofbeats as mounted men emerged from the ravine and began to close the distance with frightening speed. The entrance to Ghost Canyon appeared suddenly, a narrow crack in the earth that seemed to swallow light itself. Strange shadows moved within its depths, and Jake felt an immediate sense of unease as they approached the forbidden threshold. The air felt different here, charged with an energy that made his skin crawl and his hair stand on end. Maria paused at the entrance, her face pale with fear and reverence. She began to speak in Apache words that Jake did not understand, but recognized as some form of prayer or ritual protection, the language of her ancestors, calling upon spirits and powers that existed long before white men came to this land. "Are you certain about this?" Jake asked, his hand unconsciously moving to the grip of his pistol as if bullets could protect him from supernatural. "There is no other choice," Maria replied, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "Better to face the unknown darkness than the known evil that pursues us." She stepped across the threshold, and Jake followed without hesitation. Whatever waited for them in the depths of Ghost Canyon, they would face it together. Behind them, the sound of approaching cavalry grew louder, but ahead lay only silence and shadow. Promise of sanctuary bought with courage and the willingness to trust in forces beyond human comprehension. As they descended into the forbidden canyon, Jake felt the weight of the world above pressing down on them like a living thing. The walls seemed to pulse with hidden life, and strange echoes followed their footsteps with sounds that had no earthly source. But Maria walked beside him with her head high and her spirit unbroken. That was enough to carry him forward into whatever mysteries awaited in the realm of the angry dead. The campfire burned low in the depths of Ghost Canyon, its flickering light casting dancing shadows on walls that seemed to move with a life of their own. 3 days had passed since Jake and Maria had entered the forbidden place, and the supernatural terrors they had expected had given way to something far more profound, a peace that neither had known was possible in their turbulent world. Maria sat beside the fire, her fingers working carefully through Jake's hair as she braided small sections in the Apache style. It was an intimate gesture, one that would have been scandalous under normal circumstances. But nothing about their situation could be called normal. In this place, outside of time and conventional morality, new rules applied. Ancient laws that recognized courage and loyalty above the arbitrary divisions of race and culture. "Tell me again about the vision," Jake said softly, his voice barely audible above the whisper of wind through the canyon walls. Maria's hands paused in their work, and her eyes grew distant as she remembered the dream that had come to her on their first night in Ghost Canyon. She had awakened to find herself surrounded by the spirits of her ancestors, women of her bloodline who had faced their own trials of love and loss across the centuries. "My grandmother's grandmother spoke to me," Maria said, her voice taking on the cadence of an ancient storyteller. "She said that some bonds are forged in fire and cannot be broken by the laws of men. She said that when two spirits choose each other freely, no force on earth or in the spirit world can separate them." Jake turned to face her, his storm-gray eyes reflecting the firelight. Over the past 3 days, he had learned to read the subtle expressions that crossed Maria's face, had come to understand the strength that lay beneath her gentle exterior. She was like the desert itself, beautiful and terrible, capable of both nurturing life and destroying those who failed to show proper respect. The soldiers stopped coming, he observed. Noting the absence of the pursuit that had driven them into the sanctuary, Williams must have given up the chase. Maria nodded, but her expression remained troubled. They wait at the canyon mouth like wolves at a den entrance. They know we must emerge eventually, and they have patience enough to outlast us. It was true. Ghost Canyon provided sanctuary, but it was also a trap. The water here was sweet and cold, flowing from hidden springs deep in the earth, and there was game enough to sustain them. Rabbits and birds that seemed unafraid of human presence, as if the supernatural atmosphere of the place had gentled their wild nature. But they could not hide here forever. Eventually, they would have to return to the world above, where Captain Morrison's justice waited with rope and rifle. There might be another way, Jake said slowly, an idea forming in his mind. Something that would give us protection under both white and Apache law. Maria raised an eyebrow questioningly, and Jake felt his heart race as he prepared to voice the proposal that had been growing in his thoughts since their first night by the fire. In the strange timelessness of Ghost Canyon, his feelings for this remarkable woman had crystallized into something deeper than gratitude or desire. It was a recognition of kinship, a knowledge that they belonged together in ways that transcended the boundaries of their separate worlds. Marriage, he said simply. If we were husband and wife, the army would have a harder time separating us. And according to Apache law, I would become part of your family, your father's son-in-law. That might offer some protection. Maria stared at him in the firelight, her dark eyes searching his face for any sign of calculation or false sentiment. What she saw there made her breath catch in her throat, not the desire of a white man for an exotic trophy, but the honest love of one human being for another. It was the look she had dreamed of seeing in a man's eyes since she was old enough to understand such things. "You would take an Apache wife?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Knowing what it would cost you? The white world would reject you, call you a squaw man, spit on you in the streets of their towns." Jake reached out and touched the ragged ends of her hair, the visible reminder of the humiliation she had endured. His fingers were gentle as they traced the uneven strands, and Maria felt tears spring to her eyes at the tenderness in his touch. "They already call me an outlaw," Jake said. "I've chosen my side in this war, and it's not with men who cut away a woman's hair to shame her. If the white world has no place for me, then I'll make my home somewhere else. With you, if you'll have me." Maria closed her eyes, feeling the weight of the decision that lay before her. To marry this man would be to step irrevocably into an uncertain future, to abandon any hope of returning to the familiar patterns of Apache life. But those patterns were already broken, shattered by the relentless pressure of white expansion and military force. Perhaps it was time to create something new, to forge bonds that transcended the old divisions. "In Apache tradition," she said carefully, "marriage requires the consent of the bride's family. My father is on the reservation, watched by soldiers. He cannot give permission." "Then we'll create our own tradition," Jake replied. "The spirits of this place have seen our courage, have witnessed our loyalty to each other. Let them be our witnesses. Let the canyon itself solemnize our union." It was a radical proposal, one that would have been unthinkable under normal circumstances. But Ghost Canyon was a place outside normal rules, where the boundaries between the living and the dead, between past and future, seemed to blur and shift like desert mirages. If ever there was a place where such an unconventional marriage might be blessed, it was here among the ancient spirits and flowing water. Maria opened her eyes and looked into Jake's face, seeing there a future that was both terrifying and wonderful. This man had risked everything for her, had fought impossible odds and faced supernatural dangers for the chance to give her freedom. Now he was offering her something even more precious, a partnership built on mutual respect and genuine affection. "Yes," she said simply, and watched Jake's face transform with joy. They performed the ceremony themselves, standing hand in hand beside the sacred spring, while the canyon walls rose around them like the pillars of a natural cathedral. Jake spoke vows in English, promising to love and protect Maria for as long as breath remained in his body. Maria replied in Apache, pledging to stand beside him through whatever trials might come, to be his companion in both triumph and sorrow. As they kissed to seal their union, a strange thing happened. The shadows on the canyon walls seemed to shift and dance, forming shapes that might have been human figures raising their hands in blessing. The wind through the rocks took on a musical quality, like distant singing in languages older than memory. For a moment, the very air around them seemed to shimmer with approval, as if the spirits of the place had indeed witnessed their vows and found them acceptable. When dawn came, they prepared to leave Ghost Canyon as husband and wife. Their faces set toward an uncertain future, but their hearts filled with hope. Whatever waited for them in the world above, whether acceptance or persecution, freedom or imprisonment, they would face it together. The bond forged in the depths of the forbidden place was stronger than any law or custom, tempered by courage and sealed by love as they climbed toward the canyon mouth. Maria's hand found Jake's and held it tightly. She no longer thought about her shortened hair as a symbol of shame, but as a mark of transformation, the visible sign that she had left her old life behind and chosen a new path. Beside her, Jake Thunder walked with quiet confidence. No longer the solitary cowboy who had watched her village burn, but the husband of Maria Singing Bird, protector of her dreams and guardian of their shared future. Behind them, Ghost Canyon fell silent once more, keeping its secrets and waiting for the next desperate souls who might seek sanctuary in its shadowed depths. But for Jake and Maria, the canyon had served its purpose, giving them not just refuge, but the time and space to discover the love that would sustain them through all the battles yet to come.